Hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us. Mike McClellan is an Australian singer, songwriter, and guitarist who began his recording career in the early 70s that continues to this day. Beginning with 1972's self-titled release, Mike has released some 9 studio albums, along with many singles, a live album, and a couple of compilations to date. He may be most remembered for his single Song and Dance Man from the 1974 album Ask Any Dancer that went gold. For a time, Mike wrote for a major ad agency and tutored and taught songwriting at a couple of prestigious music academies. Mr. McClellan's star is still burning bright, as his recent live shows to standing ovations will attest. He has the reputation of being one of Australia's finest songwriters, and the story continues. Well, welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Greg. Great pleasure to join you.
Thank you for being here. Well, let's go back. I always like to start from the beginning. Where were you born, and recall some fond memories of your childhood?
I was born in Melbourne and lived there till I was about 10 years of age or so. My father was with the Australian Central Bank, which in Australia is called the Reserve Bank. He was an economist. He then got transferred to Sydney, which took the family to Sydney when I was about 10 years of age. And as a kid, I grew up loving the sound of the human voice. I sang constantly, apparently. And like every kid that grows up, born in the 50s and then into the 60s, or actually I was born in the 40s, but my early musical memories are the music of, people like Buddy Holly and the Crickets and the Everly Brothers and Jerry Lee Lewis. We didn't get much black music in Australia at the time. So what we tended to get in Australia were sort of white and Anglo-Saxon interpretations of some of the great black music, which then pushed me into trying to find out where the original source was. So, I went back to hearing people like Little Richard, of course, which was the sort of music that informed a lot of what Jerry Lee Lewis was doing. And I loved that sort of stuff. So for me, it was a very eclectic mix of music when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. Were either one of your bless you. Were either one of your parents musically inclined at all?
No, not really at all. I never really knew whether my father had any musical interest beyond liking the voice of, some of the opera singers of the day. He was a Paul Robeson fan, as were a lot of people of that time, of course. And my mum loved classical music. She loved opera, but not a lot else. There was never a sense in my house that there was music being played other than what I might have played when I was a kid growing up. So right. No, there were never really strong musical influences, although my grandfather on my mother's side had been a sort of part-time musician. He was a doctor, and they had a lovely sort of half grand piano in their house down at Mount Martha, where I, as a small boy, would go and sit and tinker on the keys. Okay. He was also a flautist, and I have his original wooden flute, which now is no longer playable because the way in which the keys on a flute are now organized is different to the old system on the flute that I have inherited from him. So, yeah, no, not a lot of music.
Okay. Can you remember one of the first singles or albums that someone got for you or that you bought?
I still have the very first single I ever bought in about 1956 in Australia, or 57, and right. It was Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers. Yeah. I still have it. And I still love the sound of those early sort of 50s productions, particularly the ones that Chet Atkins got involved in. They had a clarity and an energy about them, which was really lovely. And those early Everly Brothers harmonies were just magical. And they influenced so many people, myself included, and of course the Beatles too. They influenced the way, Lennon and McCartney put their harmonies together as well.
What music or bands were you into as a teenager?
You
start getting into
a whole eclectic mix of music and bands. I still to this day have a copy of Roy Hamilton's version of "You Can Have Her, I Don't Want Her," which was my first introduction to black call and response music. He was a fabulous singer, and that led me to going in search of the music of people like Muddy Waters, B.B. King, who I loved. I obviously loved the Beatles when I was a kid in the 60s, sort of starting to try and play guitar and write songs. They, like, so many of my contemporaries, were a huge influence at the time. And then I got introduced to really exceptional songwriters like James Taylor and Jackson Browne and Joni Mitchell through an album by a guy who became an immense influence on me. That was a wonderful American musician and songwriter called Tom Rush.
Tom Rush.
Rush, in some ways, his path led me down the same track, because he began as an interpreter of American traditional folk and blues music, and of which he was a very good interpreter, actually. But he recorded an album called The Circle Game, which took its title from the Joni Mitchell song of the same name. And as for so many of my contemporaries, that album was a huge influence, because it introduced us to the writing of those three songwriters. It gave me a sense of what was possible as a writer, acoustic guitarist. And of course, it included a wonderful, wonderful song of his called No Regrets, which ultimately was re-recorded and interpreted by the Walker Brothers out of England, became a huge hit in England and in Australia, and I think was probably a hit or a minor hit in America. But it's the most glorious song. And to me, Tom's version is still the loveliest version of that song. It's a wonderful song. And I still to this day, every now and then in concert, pull it out and play it. I've been putting together a concert production, which is essentially my history. So I play some of the early songs that influenced me. I play some of the songs from contemporary writers who influenced me. And one of the songs I use is Tom Rush's No Regrets. So they were, in fact, my influences are very eclectic, because, as a kid, I grew up listening to, a white sport coat and a pink carnation from Marty Robbins, which I loved. And then, of course, I loved Jimmy Buffett's take on that. He had an album called A White Sport Coat and a Pink Crustacean.
That's an interesting combination.
Oh yeah, and he was another big influence on me too. I used to do a couple of his early songs too, which are wonderful. He's a very fine songwriter, and of course he introduced me to people like Jerry Jeff Walker as well, because he did some of Jerry Jeff's songs. And to this day, I still do Mr. Bojangles in concert. I very rarely can get away with a concert without doing it. My version of it, to some extent, defined the song for Australians in Australia and became very much a part of my concerts. And I still love the song. And of course, it's a wonderful song.
I was thinking of one of Tom Rush's, the Child song. That's one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, that's by the Canadian songwriter. I can't remember his name now. Yeah, that's a gorgeous song. Really a lovely song.
but no regrets, like you said, is it's
Oh yeah.
yeah, classic. Well,
Abs-
what about can you remember how was the music scene when you were around that age, the teenage years?
Like like a lot of uh, the rest of the sort of Western world at the time, music was, particularly on radio, was a very eclectic blend of all sorts of stuff. By the early 60s, the folk music movement had begun to have a real impact. I obviously enough, like everybody, got influenced by Bob Dylan, and there was on radio, there was a lot of international music being played in Australia. There was not a lot in the early 60s of Australian music that was getting a lot of airplay. And a lot of what was being played and recorded in Australia were covers of hits that had been big in America or in Europe. There were folk clubs springing up all over Sydney and Melbourne and in Brisbane, which are the three biggest cities in Australia. And I began to explore those in the mid-60s. I picked up a guitar when I was in college in 63, and I was sort of struggling to try and find a way to express myself musically on the guitar, and got influenced very much by the acoustic guitar players, although I loved great electric players, of course. But the intimacy of an acoustic guitar and voice, to me, was something that I found very appealing. And back when I first started, of course, there were people emerging, like Paul Simon, of course, who was a very fine guitar player as well. I got heavily influenced by the English guitar player Bert Jansch, who in turn was quite influenced by another wonderful British player called Davy Graham. Paul Simon actually recorded a version of Davy's most famous piece, which is a piece called Angie. As indeed did Bert Jansch. And in fact, Bert's version of Angie is probably the one that most people will remember, because it was the one that got the most play. And then of course, I started to hear, the astonishing Doc Watson, who sort of introduced me to Travis Picking and that style that came out of the American country and country folk environment. And I fell in love with Doc Watson's music. And to this day, I still get great joy out of putting on a Doc Watson album. And of course, he was astonishingly influential across so many decades of acoustic music. But the other thing that people sometimes don't recognize, although I suspect it's probably more apparent in America than it was in Australia, is that Doc drew on music from all sorts of genres, from bluegrass, from pop music, from jazz, from straight blues, from a whole raft of music that he'd heard when he was growing up as a kid. But he had that ability to take music from such a wide range of genres and put his stamp on it and make it his own, and make it do so with extraordinary authenticity. That was the other thing about his ability. He was so authentically Doc Watson, and that I always loved that fact that whatever he did turned into a Doc Watson piece. It wasn't just a recreation of the way someone else might have done it. It became Doc's music. And that for me was always something I strived to do when I was trying to interpret someone else's songs. And, particularly for things like Mr. Bojangles, when I worked up an arrangement of that, my arrangement of that song is very different to the way in which Jerry Jeff might have done it. Which was always my intention, that it'd be that way. And that was what I loved about Doc Watson too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, what's the point of just duplicating it or copying a song? Yeah, you
Oh
want
yeah,
to put your own, your own stamp, on it, and want
yeah,
it to be,
yeah,
a little bit of you coming out in the song. Yeah, definitely.
indeed. And that was one of the things that for me was something I really strove to try and achieve when I was first starting out playing the acoustic clubs and the folk clubs in Australia, because there were other people doing acoustic music, obviously, and a lot of music that was being played, and not a lot of songwriting, but some.
Mhm.
And I quickly realized that if I was going to build a reputation in that environment, I had to be different to everybody else. So at the time when I started in Australia, I was quite a rare finger picker, actually. There were very few others who were doing what I was doing and who'd taken what I was doing from the original source, as I had done from a lot of what was going on in the American music. And that was evident too when I first met my old mate Tommy Emmanuel, because Tommy had gone to the same source I'd gone to. He'd listened to Chet Atkins and gone, "Oh, I love that," and so did I, of course, too. I mean, Tom's a freak, absolute freak.
Definitely
And
two peas in a pod, two like-minded. Yeah.
yeah, indeed. And in
Yeah.
fact, when I first met Tommy, which was about 1974 or 75, I think, a mutual friend brought him into my dressing room after a concert. And he said to me, "Oh, you got to meet this kid. He's great." And Tommy was about 19 at that stage, I think. And he's just 10 years younger than I am. And he brought Tommy into the dressing room. We chatted for a little while and talked about, our influences and what we played, etc. And I said to Tom, "Pick up the guitar, play me something," because I hadn't heard him play. I knew by reputation that that he was good. He sat down and he played a little ragtime piece that I had recorded called Catfish Rag.
Okay.
But what astonished me was he played it better than I could, and he added things to it that I hadn't thought of. And I sat there with my mouth open going, "Oh, what have we got here?" And of course, I then used him on recordings. He came and played concerts with me. We did some touring together very early on in the piece.
So
And there were nights.
the audition. He passed the audition, then.
Oh, did he what? In fact, on occasions, Greg, when we toured together, just the two of us, he would open the show and do a set. Then I would bring him back on stage for the second half of the show, and he'd play with me. There were nights when his playing would so blow me away, I'd forget the next vocal cue. He'd do a solo. I'd sit there going, "I don't believe what I'm hearing here," and I would forget I've got to come in and sing the next verse. It was wonderful.
Yeah,
It really.
you kind of lost where you were. And
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Well, what kind of places or clubs did you gig to play early on before you got your contract?
I was playing university campus tours as part of generally a collective of acoustic and folk musicians. Did quite a number of those in the late 60s, early 70s. In 72, as you noted, I'd done one album, which got quite nice reviews, but didn't make any real waves. And I was doing the odd sort of collective concert and festivals, like a lot of what was going on in America. Festivals were starting to become important. Newport Folk Festival, of course, had started to build quite a substantial reputation in America. And there were folk entrepreneurs in Australia who were thinking, oh, we can do the same thing here. So we started to build a small circuit of folk music festivals. And I got invitations to play those. I've often felt that that very first album was really an album by a guy who was trying to figure out how to write good songs and how to produce an album, because it was done us about. I went into the studio with a friend who had said, oh, I'll give you some studio time, come and do put down some of the songs you're writing. So I did. I went in just with guitar and voice. And the guy who owned the studio and had a small record company said, oh, I like that. Why don't you put some other stuff around it? We'll put it out, which is literally what happened. So everything else on that album is an overdub. Drums, bass, guitars, string sections, keyboards, vocals. It astonishingly doesn't necessarily sound like it.
No.
And you got to remember, this is 71, 72. And it still has a coherency about it that in the end, when I look back on it now, to me says, yeah, we did a pretty good job at recording it. Yeah. But for me, the songs are a bit naive and a bit, they're evidently the sort of songs that were probably typical of the time, but typical of a slowly maturing songwriting environment in Australia that wasn't as good as the sort of music I was listening to and trying to emulate. So of the songs that are on it, I probably only do 2 out of it these days. I still sing There Is a Place, the New England song, which is where I'd gone to college. And I still occasionally pull out some other Sunrise. But they're the only 2 that I would regard as worthy of continuing.
Well, I was going to mention a couple. That's one, some other Sunrise, but
yeah.
Playing it by ear is one that I like. I love the guitar playing in that one.
Yeah, that was another one which I thought about re-recording and putting on a best of collection, and wound up not doing so because I was literally running out of room to put it onto a best of at that time. Interestingly enough, that song was pretty much written out of what was going on around me at the time. I'd come out of a television show, which I'd done for 2 years, which was a sort of primetime Friday night television show of popular music called The Sound of Music. I'd come out of it a little disillusioned because I'd been rung on Christmas Eve on the end of the 2nd year of the series, and it went to air every Friday night with a break over the Christmas period. And I got rung and in a very, very brief conversation said, oh, look, we won't need you next year. And, you know, when the crew broke up for the Christmas break, there had been no inkling that any of us would be dropped from the show. And as it turned out, several people got the same sort of phone call that I got. And in addition to which, the bloke who fronted the show and compared it, and was a wonderful singer and performer actually, was also dropped from the show, which surprised everybody. And the show fizzled after the 3rd year. It didn't progress much beyond about, I think 2/3 of the way into what was a projected year-long run, and failed. So some of those early songs were driven by that sense of disillusionment and my sense that that show was very, very valuable in helping me get that very first album contract. Okay. But it was also very valuable in introducing me to a much, much broader musical and sort of more commercial environment too. So in that regard, looking back, I can see that it was really important to me in my early career. And for that, I'm very grateful, because it got me in front of a lot of people I might not have had a chance to go and meet at the time. So that was good. So that first album, as I said, is it's sort of me feeling my way into the business, put it that way.
Yeah, so no sour grapes over that TV show then. Yeah.
No, not really, no.
Not really. Learning experience. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you've heard comparisons to Gordon Lightfoot, which is not bad company.
Yes.
Sad to hear of his passing recently. He was, how old was he? I don't remember.
83, I think, wasn't he? 82 or 83 when he died.
Yeah, he wasn't looking good in his last few years. Yeah,
he'd had a lot of health problems, hadn't he?
Yeah, he really had. But
yeah.
your sophomore release, Ask Any Dancer, did very well.
Yeah.
And I told you before when we were emailing, that's the album that I first picked up and heard your music. And I think my favorite song is Rock and Roll Lady. I think off of that album. I love the orchestration and the strings. I mean, that always gets me. Whenever they put strings on a song, and it's done very well on that one. Yeah.
The string arrangements for that were done by a wonderful Australian musician called Graham Lyle, whom I met through doing the television show, actually, which was very fortuitous. Rock and Roll Lady got covered around the world. Rick Nelson did a version in America. There were several other versions in America. It's been covered about, I think, 9 or 10 times in Australia. It was covered in Britain. Was covered in South Africa by a guy who also covered Song and Dance Man. And it's a song I still do in concert. And I guess the measure of a good song is whether or not I still get some pleasure out of doing it. And I still get pleasure out of doing that song. And, like a lot of the songs on that album, there's quite a leap between the quality of the writing on that album to the very first album. And there's a real sense of maturity in what I was writing too. And it was a really very different experience recording that album too, because I was signed to EMI in Australia with a much bigger budget, more resources. And while you mention you love strings, so do I. I love the sound of real strings. There is nothing quite like being in a studio and hearing the sound of really good string section being put over the back of what you've written. And that can be quite an exhilarating experience. And it certainly was with the stuff that Graham was writing for me, because we'd done the basic tracks and sent them down to Melbourne, to Graham. He then wrote the charts and came back to Sydney, where we recorded them in the big studio with mostly players from the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, which is a very good orchestra. So it was quite a surprise to hear what he would write. And sitting in the studio, hearing some of the charts he wrote, I'd sit there and go, oh, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck going up, because I just loved what he was doing.
Yeah, that's what I call that, when you get the goosebumps,
Oh yeah.
Those type of songs. Oh man, yeah. A couple other tracks off of Ask Any Dancer that I really like was Traces and Saturday Dance. I think both of those are really, really good tracks.
It's interesting you should comment that way, because Traces was one of those songs that was built around the guitar riff. And it's my guitar part is actually played in an open tuning. It's in open G tuning. So I was experimenting with quite a lot actually with open tuning. So driven to some extent by slide players, because I'd started to play using a slide in open D tuning. And I just loved the sound of those open tunings. So that song Traces was very much generated by that. The sax solo through that song at the end of it, that's Graham Lyle. And his playing on that is just gorgeous, really lovely. And it was one of the last tracks we recorded for that album. Saturday Dance, were I to record that again, I would do it rather differently now. My early vocals on both the very first album and the next two, when I listen back to them now, the product of a very youthful sounding voice. And at times I was striving too much for technical pitch perfection, but not, for me at least now, not actually delivering a performance as well as I might have done. The vocals at times are a little too mannered, but no, they were a product of me learning how to do it, of course, too. And I'd always, in those early days, never felt I was as good a singer as I really wanted to be. And I had mates who were just astonishing singers and who I sort of grew up with in the music industry. And I've always loved the sound of their voices. And there's a friend of mine who sings vocals on Rock and Roll Lady. He sings the harmony on it, a singer called Graham Lowndes, who was with me in a little blues band we had at one stage back in the late 60s, actually. And he was an extraordinary singer. And I just loved the sound of his voice. And I always at times thought, oh God, I wish I could sing like that. But I couldn't. So, and if I were doing Saturday Dance now, I'd probably do it in a more stripped down version. And I do it virtually at every concert because, you know, like you, for a lot of other people, it's a favorite song of that album. And it was again, it's one of those songs that got reasonably widely covered in Australia and several other versions around the world. And I still love doing it. I still get a joy out of it. And that for me is a measure, as I said, of a good song.
Yes, it is. I had to mention with Traces, when I first saw the track on the album before I listened to it, I thought it was the cover of the Classics 4, the Dennis Shostak Classics 4. And then when it started playing, I said, no, this is a different song altogether.
Indeed.
Of course, Song and Dance Man did very well, even being voted Song of the Year at the annual Music Industry Award. So, you know, at the time that it was released, after you finished recording the song and everything, that you had a big hit on your hands. Did you feel like?
We knew that of the songs that we were going to record for that album, that Song and Dance Man would be the first single we'd release. We didn't know just how successful it might be. We knew it was a strong song. I'd been doing it in concert for about 18 months before I recorded it, actually, and it always got very good reaction. And there was a feeling when we started to record that, yeah, this looks like it might get off the ground. The only reservation that we had was that it was unlike what you might call a traditional pop song in Australia. And the pop charts in Australia was the measure of commercial success, of course, as indeed they were for all around the world. And I can recall at one stage the marketing director of EMI saying to me, as we were about to release it, he said, it doesn't sound like Normie Rowe. And Normie Rowe was a very successful Australian pop singer at the time. And there were several other bands in Australia whose music I really enjoyed, and guys that became mates out of those bands, and it didn't sound like their music either. And he said, you know, this may or may not work as well as we might hope, but we'll follow it up with a couple of others. And we knew that Rock and Roll Lady was going to be a single. Unfortunately, my version of Rock and Roll Lady got released unbeknown to myself and the record company at exactly the same time that the record company in competition to EMI, one of them in Australia, put out Rick Nelson's version of my song. Oh. So that tended to split the market, which was a bit of a shame. And it never quite achieved the commercial success we had hoped it might. But Song and Dance Man had done it, so that it wasn't as serious a problem as we had thought. But you know, like a lot of singers, when you have that first big hit, you tend to get tagged with the title of that song. So I've been forever known in Australia as the Song and Dance Man.
I wonder, did that perhaps have a bit of roots with Jerry Jeff Walker, maybe, and Mr. Bojangles?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Very much so. I was listening to a lot of Jerry Jeff. I was listening to Jimmy Buffett and people of that ilk, including you know, Guy Clark and early Rodney Crowell, and that sort of crossover between folk, pop, and country that was now classified as roots music, of course. And the other writer around that period also who was a huge influence was Jackson Browne. And I used to do quite a few Jackson Browne songs in concert. I'd pull out you know, things like Song for Adam, or some of those early songs that were on that very first album of his, which I loved. It was in that sense, of course, what I'd done as I progressed as a writer was synthesize so much of that early music that I was listening to. So for me, the very first album is a bit too influenced by some of what I was listening to, and I can still hear a lot of my early influences in that first album. But by the time the second one came along, my identity had become more firmly fixed as a songwriter, and I was starting to find my own voice rather than trying in a way to emulate what I'd been listening to.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I think, my opinion, one of your best singles from that earlier period is Carry Me. I just love that track.
That's you're not the only one. Melanie loved it too. I toured with Melanie as her support act in Australia, and she loved that song and was going to go and record it. And in fact, I'd been booked to do a tour with her in America after we'd completed the one in Australia. But unfortunately, she was being supported on the tour by the record company she was signed to, who were going to put money behind it to try and sell a new album. And when they presented the album to the record company didn't like the album and didn't want to support the tour because they didn't think that the album was going to be a success. And I think Melanie's late husband, Peter Shakaric, had a major blow up with the record company over that release. So the tour never happened, unfortunately. So I never got to America at that time. But I had the real pleasure when I was first doing the first concert with Melanie, of performing that song and then realizing that Melanie was standing off to my right, off to the stage, listening really intently to the song, and came up to me after I walked off, before she was then to go on after interval, and said, "Did you write that?" I said, "Yeah, I did actually." She said, oh, I love that song. So it was a nice compliment coming from someone whose writing I admired.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Kind of the full circle thing. Well, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, speaking of touring, during the mid-'70s, you toured with some pretty big name artists.
Yeah.
You care to name drop a few?
I tell you who was the most enjoyable and the most delightful, and from whom I learnt a huge amount actually, was touring with Roger Miller.
Okay.
On several nights after concerts in other cities, he and I and his guitar player would sit around in the room, share a drink and swap songs and stories. He was the most generous man. Unlike a lot of major touring acts, took the time to both encourage and engage with me, whereas most of the touring acts you worked with came in, you were there as the support because it was mandatory in those days, touring Australia, that you had to have a local support act before you could tour. So they didn't pay a lot of attention to me. Although I toured with Dr. Hook as well at one stage. Oh, yeah. Boy. They were wild boys. If you breathe too heavily on the bus from the hotel to the airport in the mornings, you could wind up getting very high on dope, I tell you. How interesting. On one occasion, one of them, whom I should probably not name, got into quite a bit of trouble actually. We were back in Sydney, staying in the Siebel Townhouse Hotel in Sydney after having flown from Adelaide. We were then due to go on and play concerts in New Zealand. And at around about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, I got woken up by the crashing sound of a door being broken into in the room 2 doors down from mine in the hotel. It turned out that one of the boys in the band had dragged onto the plane with him from Adelaide to Sydney the daughter of the Mayor of Adelaide, and the Mayor of Adelaide got a little pissed off, so he got the cops to come in and raid the hotel in the Siebel Townhouse, smash in the door with a sledgehammer and drag the daughter out of it, and they were going to charge the member of the band, oh God knows, with abduction and something else, I think. I think she was just beyond the age of consent, but I don't know that for sure. But clearly she'd been having a good time, and so had the boy in the band, but the hotel got their door bashed in.
See, that's what I like, these interviews, to hear those interesting anecdotes, those kind of stories like that.
That was a fun tour.
Yeah. Everybody's got those kind of stories.
Oh yeah.
Well, you mentioned Rick Nelson doing Rock and Roll Lady. How did you like his version?
I loved it actually. I thought it was a lovely version. And he, he was a singer that I grew up with as a kid, of course, in the 50s when he was first having hits. And I followed his progress with real interest because he started out as a pop idol on the family television show in the 50s, and had a string of lovely hit songs actually in the 50s and into the 60s. But then as the 60s came upon us and into the 70s, he started to look for music that had more to say. and and a sort of garden party was
Right.
was an interesting song for him, because it makes clear reference to the fact that he's going in a different direction, and if you don't like it, stiff. It was sort of, if you don't like the music I'm doing, I'm still going to do it, sort of thing. I've left the pop past behind. He recorded my song in the company of Dylan songs and a whole variety of other writers whose work I admired. So I felt very privileged to be in that company. And I thought his version was a lovely version.
Yeah. Well, switching gears a little bit, in 1979, MC the TV series National Star Quest, which was a segue to taking the helm on ABC program Country Road, which was renamed Mike McClellan's Country Road. Did you enjoy hosting that show?
I loved it, actually. It was interesting for me because, having worked in television back in the late 60s, early 70s on the show that I did for 2 years, I had some understanding about what it took to actually front a show and make it work. I was fortunate in that the reason we changed the show, well, it was twofold. A, they wanted to use my name to project it into the marketplace a little bit more. And B, I wasn't a strictly country music singer performer. There were other country shows, and from my own background and from the music that I'd been writing and performing and recording, it was pretty evident that I didn't fit comfortably into that strict country music category. So to call it Mike McClellan's country music, as we subsequently did, meant that we could therefore broaden the musical context a little bit. And it wasn't necessarily just straight country music. It could be the sort of stuff that's now called roots music. It could be Jackson Browne. It could have been Paul Simon. It could have been Jerry Jeff. It could have been Guy Clark, or even some of the sort of pop country hits of the day, without necessarily losing the country audience, but inviting another audience into the show as well. So that was great fun, actually, because, and interesting enough, my two directors during that series are still great friends. I still see them and talk to them regularly. One of them lives a couple of hours south of where I live these days. The other one is living closer to Sydney, but we communicate regularly. They're great mates. They're both now retired. And they were hugely influential in helping me come to terms with what it meant to front a national show where it was going to go out to a marketplace, in lots of instances out in provincial and rural Australia, where there was only one television station available on the commercial network, and where the national broadcaster, the ABC, had by far the biggest part of the audience. So it was hugely important to me too, because it introduced me to markets that didn't know me, and enabled me to go back and tour through those provincial and country areas with a reputation well established. Although Song and Dance Man had been a hit pretty broadly in those sorts of markets, it had been a while from 74 till the late 70s and early 80s before I was to have another big hit. So the television show was very valuable in getting me into markets that I hadn't really explored.
Oh, okay. Yeah, help broaden your fan base a little bit there.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Well, I want to hear about this. How was it working with Harry Vanda and George Young on the Laughing in the Dark album, the Easy Beats? Yeah, that was probably my first Australian band that I ever got into, the Easy Beats. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for all of us in Australia, Friday on My Mind is a real touchstone.
Right.
And it's a hugely enjoyable pop song.
Mhm.
And those guys were remarkable. And it was interesting too, because at the time when the marketplace had become aware of the fact that I was then going to go and record with Harry and George, and Harry and George had had huge success with great pop music, great rock and roll, and several people had remarked at the time, "Oh, that's a pretty weird left turn for them to make to record a bloke like you, isn't it?" And what people failed to realize, I think, was that Harry and George were extraordinarily good at defining what was needed to make a song work as a recorded instrument. And that was what they brought to my music. They had this terrific sense of what was the best way to bring the song out. And that's essentially what a good producer does. I mean, a good producer's role is to take whatever songs they're working with and treat them in the best possible way to make the most of the song. And that's exactly what Harry and George did. But they were terrific to work with. They were really clever with very, very firm ideas about how to make something work. And it was a real joy to work with them, because they understood too that I'd had a lot of experience by that stage. I'd been recording for 8 years or more. And what we did when we did that album was we sat down with a rhythm section, and Harry and George and I would work out what the rhythm section should be like and what the structure of the song should be like. So we'd get the basic feel happening, we'd get bass guitar and drums working, and sometimes keyboards as well. And we'd work our way through the way in which to manage the structure and the rhythmic feel of a song. And then essentially, once that was done, they left the rest up to me. They were busy doing AC/DC. They were busy doing a whole raft of stuff. I mean, their output during the 60s, 70s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s was enormous. They had a string of hits in Australia, the like of which no one else had ever been able to duplicate. It was just quite amazing, actually.
I like
and
George Young with Flash in the Pan as well.
I loved Hayes and Peter.
Right.
which is a great piece of pop music.
And walking in the rain, walking.
Oh yeah.
I like the way he did it. It was just so he would talk, basically, not sing, but just talk, walking in the rain and the rain. So the way
they were really clever guys. And sadly, of course, George Young is no longer with us. He died a few years ago. Harry's still in the business. He's got a studio in Sydney, which his son runs, and does most of the engineering. And I think Harry's sort of basically fully retired now. But I learned a lot doing music with those two guys, and took some of the principles that they applied to my songs. And then subsequently, when I worked in the advertising industry, taking some of their approaches to heart and working the way they did, which proved not only enjoyable and engaging, but also demonstrated to me just how you could achieve what you really wanted to what was going on in your head by having a very clear sense of how you should brief musicians and how you should engage with the musicians without necessarily writing a chart for them, but being able to enthuse them with what it was that you really needed. So that was really valuable.
Right. Very, very interesting how along the way in your career, how different people and individuals were instrumental in helping you, helping you feed your career, helping you become who you are. I think they're all there at the right the right place and time, you know.
Yeah, and as you undoubtedly are aware, making music is a very collaborative process. And one of the great joys for me has always been as a songwriter is to hear what other people bring to the songs I've written.
Right.
There's nothing better than listening to someone blow me away with the way in which they've added to something I've written and given it or taken it in a direction which I might not have initially heard. And that's a huge pleasure.
Oh, definitely. It must be. We'll talk
Mm.
about special memories from touring the UK and America during 1982.
Yeah, I was I was a bit of a novice in so many ways in that regard. I left Australia with the intention to try and use London as a base. I'd been at times encouraged to go and live and work in America. But I'd seen at that point when I was thinking about it, by the end of the 70s, early 80s, I'd seen a lot of my contemporaries really struggle to achieve anything either in America or in London and return home somewhat disillusioned and owing a huge amount of money. My contemporaries in the Little River Band, for instance, returned from America after the first tour owing a fortune, despite all the success that they had in America. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to commit my family to those sorts of impositions, and decided that, yeah, I'd go and live in London. My first marriage had fallen apart sort of around 76, 77. And I was newly married in the early 80s. And my then wife wanted to go and work in London in a hospital there. She was a doctor. So we took off. I played some concerts in some small clubs in America on the way there, and got a reasonably good reaction, although there were some people who in America who couldn't quite understand my Australian accent at the time, and quite a lot of people who said to me, "Oh, you're British, are you?" And I had to say, "No, I'm actually Australian." And I played, when living in London, I played several festivals and again, some of the smaller folk clubs. And at one stage, I got offered a contract in London with the Noel Gay organisation, which at one stage looked after Elton John and a whole raft of big names, but eventually walked away from it. They wanted 50% of everything I would earn. And they wouldn't budge on that. And I thought, no, I'm sorry, I don't wish to do that. My wife and I were keen to start a family. We wanted to return to Australia. And, you know, at that stage, by the time we started to go back, looking back from London to home, Australia was going through a recession. The early 80s were a difficult time around the world, actually. We were living in London when the IRA were very active and blew up a bandstand in one of the parks and killed a number of British horse guards and their horses. And you know, it was the Thatcher era, and the economy was struggling in London. And I'd had a bit of interest out of America in going back and doing more, but it never quite materialized. And I'd been told by a number of people, look, if you really want to get a break in America, you're going to have to come and live here. And I didn't really want to do that. I'd had an old friend of mine, a songwriter called Doug Ashdown, and his writing partner had been signed by Tree Publishing in Nashville in the early 70s. And Doug came back, having lived there for a couple of years, quite distressed actually, because he and his writing partner, Jimmy Stewart, had been in a supermarket in Nashville, and Doug was standing at one checkout counter and his mate Jimmy was at another. And Doug looked up to see a guy pull a gun and put it to the head of Jim Stewart and say to the cashier, "Give me all the money you got." And Doug packed up and left Nashville a day or two later and didn't ever go back. And I thought, do I want to put my kids through something like that? Because if I was going to go and live in America, they were at the age where traveling with me to America, not necessarily constantly, but frequently, given that I shared custody with my former wife, I didn't want to put them into environments where that sort of threat could materialize. So I came back and decided to live in Australia at that stage. And it meant for me a slowing down of my market as a songwriter and a singer, and concert numbers in Australia were declining anyway for almost everybody who was out touring. So it made quite a change in direction for me at that stage. And I came back a little disillusioned, but nonetheless still convinced that I wanted to continue to try and turn my talent into a reasonable living to support my two kids from my first marriage and the third daughter that my second wife and I were to have.
Well, I think you made the right choice. And just think about if you could come over to America these days. I mean, talk about gun violence. I mean, Doug experienced something there that was kind of a bit of a rarity, but today it's rampant. It's every week,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I find it really distressing, quite frankly, Greg, because when I was at university back in the late 60s as a student, I had a fascination with American politics and American history, which I loved. I found it really enjoyable and stimulating, and I found the internal issues, particularly with racism, etc., in America, to be, if not insoluble, at least was going to place great stresses and strains on the American environment. But to see America under such stress now, from a country whose creative influences on me had been enormous, is really distressing, quite frankly. And that was the genesis of that song, Letter to America, that I wrote. Because
Go ahead.
It was written out of real distress to see what America had become, and an America whose creative arts I've loved, and had a profound influence on me, not only just musically, but in so many other ways as well. So, it wasn't a choice to go and live in America at the time after I came back from London, although I still looked to what America could offer, and I still felt that, the America that I had loved and enjoyed so much, having traveled there on several occasions, was still a place that I really valued as an influence in my own creativity. There were signs even back then that things weren't as good as they should be. Right. And of course, America, the involvement in Vietnam was a huge controversy. That was a terrible mistake for both America and Australia to get so deeply involved in something that in the end proved entirely futile.
Right.
And cost lives.
Yeah, countless lives, like you said, and just the heartache that went through that.
Yeah, indeed.
Still suffering today from that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Well,
yeah.
talk a little bit about when you went back to Australia working for the ad agency. Was that like jingle writing? Is that what you were doing?
Yeah, well, it started out that way. I'd had several ad agencies come to me in the 70s and ask if they could buy the rights to some of my songs for campaigns. And in fact, I'd had a second hit in Australia from that album I did with Harry and George, a song called The One I Love. And I'd been asked if that could be used in a campaign on several occasions. And I often responded at that time by saying, well, look, I'm not prepared to sell you the rights to this song unless it's for an absolute fortune. And I got offered a fortune for The One I Love in the end and succumbed. The money was a significant encouragement, put it that way. But I said, look, if you want something from me of that style and nature, I'm happy to write it for you, which I did very anonymously. And more often than not in those days, because of the profile I had in television and in the other environments, I wouldn't sing it. I'd get another singer to come in and do it. Then when I came back to Australia, as I said, the concert market had declined. And I wanted a little bit more stability. I didn't want to be traveling as much. Fiona was fully into her medical practice at that stage. We wanted to start a family. I'd traveled constantly in the 70s and early 80s. I once did 60 towns just in New South Wales in 10 weeks. Which was a concert of 6 out of 7 nights a week in different locations. And it was a huge amount of travel. And I'd got to the point where I would rather be home and do something else. So I'd had approaches and I thought, I'll go and knock on a few doors. So I knocked on the door of Mojo, one of whom I knew vaguely. They both knew my work, and the one I knew vaguely loved my writing. And he said when I walked through the door, well, you've come just at the right time. I was going to give you a call. I knew you were back and I thought there's something here I think we can get you to do for us. So I spent about 10 months working freelance for them. And, they'd ring me up and say, can you come and have a chat about something? So, I'd go, and more often than not, when I got a brief from Mojo, it was, we've got a set of lyric ideas for this campaign, and here's the hook line. Here's the line we're going to use to sell the product. Can you write us something for that? It needs music. It's probably going to be a 60-second commercial. We'll cut it to 30. So that's what I did. And progressively over that 10 months, the boys would come and say to me, take me out to lunch and go, hey, listen, don't go do any more work for other people. Come and work for us and we'll put you on contract and we'll pay you this. And for the first 2 times, I knocked it back because I thought, no, I want to keep some independence. When they made me a very handsome offer the 3rd time, I said, okay, look, I tell you what, I'll come for 2 years. Let's do a 2-year contract at this stage and see where it goes. So I wound up, in the end, doing much, much more than just the music. In the end, the brief from Mo and Joe would be, mate, we've just picked up this piece of business. What do you reckon we should do with this one? So I'd go away and come back with a campaign idea and some music if it needed music. And that was for me a huge confirmation that I had recognition from 2 of the finest advertising writers in the country that what I was capable of doing was good. And it was also a real confirmation for me that it didn't have to be just about music, that there was a lot of good strategic thinking that could be done, and I could do it prior to actually going into a studio and executing what it was that you might have been trying to develop. I wound up doing a couple of campaigns for them, which were just purely print, involved no music at all. And it was a quite liberating experience, actually. And an old friend of mine, and this is a funny story, actually, the guy that did the artwork for my early albums and put them together and did the typesetting, etc., became a good friend.
Mhm.
And I walked into Mojo to start there the first day of my contract with them as a permanent member of the team. And there's Freddie. I said, "Oh, you in here doing some freelance work?" He said, "No." He said, "No, I'm on staff now." I said, "Really?" "So am I." and he was an art director. So we wound up being put together as a team to work on campaigns. And 2 years there with the boys at Mojo, at which point they then did a big merger with another Australian advertising agency. And Freddie and I had decided that we would leave and set up our own business, which we then subsequently did. The merger for Mojo was not terribly successful. Mojo was a very freewheeling, very creative agency. We rarely, if ever, got a written brief from a suit. It was invariably, let's sit around and work our way through this, discuss what we think we do, and then go away and write something. They merged with a very successful Melbourne-based advertising agency, which was very different.
Okay.
Merger was because MDA in Melbourne were very good at the sort of building a client roster, managing the business, but not necessarily very creative. So the merger to everybody seemed like, well, maybe this will work because there's the management side on one agency and there's a really creative side on another, in addition to which the Melbourne agency was listed. So it automatically gave the Mojo boys a handsome return and a listing and shares. So for them, financially very valuable. There's a guy in Australia called John Singleton who had a profound influence on the advertising industry in Australia at the time. He characterized the merger as, "Oh, I don't know about this one. It's a bit like merging the Beatles with the post office." and so it proved.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's a clever characterization because it turned out to be exactly what it was in the end. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
So, you know, and Freddie and I then went off and set up our own business, which was an interesting period for me because we grew the business, built success, but then got we made the decision we were going to sell part of it to a multinational who was really keen to get a hold of our talent, because one of the things that I'd done in particular when I was at Mojo was create a very, very successful campaign for an airline in Australia. And this international company wanted my expertise on Singapore Airlines, which they had the account for. And they knocked on our door very early in our establishment, the agency, but we knocked it back. And we'd brought in a third partner, and he and I had huge disagreements, unfortunately. He turned out to be a very difficult bloke to work with. And at that point, I decided I'd bail out and set up my own business and do it myself in the sort of the mid-90s.
At the beginning of the new millennium, you helped put together, and time again, a double CD retrospective of your career. Did you mine the back catalog, or there's still unreleased tracks involved?
There were some unreleased tracks, versions of some that were never released. There was a version of a song that I sort of wanted to record, but never quite got to it. And I re-recorded 2 songs off that very first album that I'd done back in 1972. I re-recorded There Is a Place and some other sunrise. But I did them very simply, pretty much just myself, some vocal harmonies, another guitar part, and some synth pads behind them. And I was pretty happy with the way they came out, actually. So that was pleasing. There was a version of a song called California Cool on the compilation, which was done as the flip side for a single that went nowhere, unfortunately. And the studio version was a really nice version, which I'd recorded in Melbourne. So we put that on the album. And a song which I'd recorded for an album which I did for EMI at the end of the 80s, early 90s, called New York City Blues, which I'd never released. And it was recorded for an album called The Heartland. But in the end, we decided not to include it. But I put it on the compilation because it actually sat nicely with the other songs around it. But essentially, it was just going back and pulling stuff out of the back catalogue. In some ways, it nicely rekindled interest in some of that back catalogue, because it had been a while since I'd done any recording or released anything of any real substance. And the other thing it did for me was that I was getting to that point after probably nearly 20 years doing advertising and putting to one side my own creative work, starting to think maybe I should rekindle it. Maybe I should get back to doing what I'd done in the first place and what had got me into the advertising industry in the first place, which was my music. Right. And by the early part of this new millennium, I'd got to that stage too, where I was getting a little disillusioned with the way in which the advertising industry was going. My work had become more about developing strategies and helping clients create appropriate marketing plans rather than doing much creative work. In my own business, I did very little creative work. I managed the business and engaged other creative people to assist in developing campaigns, simply because I just didn't have the time. Right. And the other thing I also realized too was that the one thing I was really missing was being back on stage doing my own songs and having some new songs to sing. So I made the conscious decision by around 2008, after having cut my business back to mostly just a consulting business, that I would start to record again, because I'd had a bunch of about probably 15 to 20 songs that I'd done nothing with, that I thought maybe it's time to do something with. So it was actually a real pleasure to get back to doing it. And I went back to playing the folk festival circuits and small venues after the release of the double album. And in a way, it was a bit of a rebirth, because I suddenly realized that I'd really had missed it a lot more than I had been prepared to admit myself. So that was a joy, actually.
Yeah, I hear that. I'm not a musician myself, but I know that if it's inside you, it's got to come out. And yeah. It's a lifelong process. You're continually growing through it, but if you're a musician, you've got to write and perform and do all that. You've got to.
There's a quote by a very famous American advertising writer whose surname I can't recall now, but he wrote a very, very good book about the art of writing but the art of being creative as well. And he says at one point early in the book about his life in the advertising industry that suits in the advertising industry have careers, writers have lives. And that to me summed up in a very succinct fashion the difference between those who spent their lives organizing stuff and building relationship with clients and organizing businesses, etc. And those who wrote simply because that was what they needed to do. And if that's what you need to do, you don't stop, because that's one of the driving forces in your life, that you find a way to express that creativity, to release that energy. And in so many ways, of course, too, to find a level of satisfaction in the things that drive you. And for me, despite the fact that at times it can be a very frustrating process, there's no greater satisfaction in my creative life than actually being able to look at a song, pick up the guitar and play it and think, that's just about as good as I can do at this point. There's going to be more that'll be better, and I'm still going to go see if I can find it. But at this stage, I'm pretty happy with that one.
Right. That's good. Well, leading up to, you were talking about the late 2008, 2009, then came your If Only for a Moment from 2011. One of the tracks off of that, my favorite is A Hand to Hold. I think that's the one that I go back to. Yeah,
and a lot of people do, and it's one of the songs off that album that I play regularly in concert. And it was written for a very specific purpose, actually. Back in 1974, when I did the first album with EMI, my producer said to me when we started to do the sessions, and among the first of them was the session for Song and Dance Man, he said, I want to bring in a new piano player for you, because I think it'll be great for your stuff. And having worked in the television industry and worked in a studio and done a first album, I knew quite a few piano players. I'd never met this guy. He walked into the studio. He looked like an accountant, and he was 6'6". He was late for the session. And I thought, oh, there's a good start. Okay. Tell you what, though, he didn't play like an accountant. He was brilliant, wonderful, wonderful player. And he became one of my dearest and closest friends. And for the next, pretty much the next 25 or 26 years, an enormous amount of the music that I created, he was a part of, either writing charts or playing piano or assisting with production. We would often spend time in his little home studio doing demo tracks before going into a bigger studio. And he was a wonderful musician, wrote an enormous amount of music and contributed a huge amount to the lives of so many musicians and performers in Sydney in particular. And then, very sadly, in 1999, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And by the time of his diagnosis, it was terminal. It had escaped the prostate. They found cancer in a lot of his bones. And we knew at that stage that it was highly unlikely that he would survive more than 18 months to 2 years. And towards the end of that 18 months, with him not well, but still playing, a whole group of us decided that we would hold a concert in his honor, but do so before he passed away, so that he could be there to share the concert, play if he wished, and also to be the recipient of the love and the respect that so many people felt for him in the industry. And a lot of people created stories, and there were some wonderful stories about him. I mean, he was one of those people for whom there were a million stories, and he loved all of them, and he acknowledged all of them. And I thought, what can I do to honor him?
Yeah.
And in the end, I thought the best thing I can do was to do what I had done for so long, which was write a song for him. So A Hand to Hold was specifically written for him and first played at that concert. Okay. And it's gone on to become a song that I've got asked to do at funeral services and celebratory services for others in somewhat similar situations on a number of occasions. If I do it for others, I generally leave out the second verse and do just the first and third verses, because that second verse is very specifically about the role that Tony played in my life. And you know, it's a song that when I sing now, I can't but reflect on the passing of my very good friend and what he meant to me, because he was hugely influential in my musical life. And I struggled for a while when we lost him, and because I'd lent on him so much for so much of what I'd done, at one point that sense of loss made me start to question how I was going to go on, given that he was no longer a part of my musical and personal life. But also at the same time, it was probably what forced me to take a bit of a leap into the unknown and try other things, which I subsequently did.
Right, right. That's very touching, very, very nice. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know that it was about your friend. Moving on to 2014's Dancing in the Rain. Dance in the Rain.
Yeah.
Is a great track off of that one. But I think probably my favorite on the album is I Wonder Who You're Waiting For. I think that's one of your best all-time songs. Even going back to your earlier years, I think it's a great track.
Yeah, that song got significant reaction from that album. It didn't chart much more than about, I think, 22, 23, but it was never a huge hit. But it got quite a lot of airplay, and it's one of the songs in my concerts that I most frequently get asked to play, which and it grew out of an observation I'd made, and I often introduce it on stage by telling the story of returning home from a concert in Melbourne and sitting in the departure lounge at Melbourne Airport, waiting to get on a plane that was coming through from Hobart in Tasmania and taking me on to Sydney, and watching a small group of people gathering to greet those who were going to come off the plane that I was about to get on, and looking at one particular woman standing at the back of this group who was stunning. And I thought, oh, I wonder who you're waiting for. And then I did that thing of looking at the people coming off the plane to my left and seeing if I could pick who it was she might be waiting for. and I'd go, no, I don't think so. Probably not. Then I'd look back over here to my right to see if she'd reacted. And whoever it was she was waiting for didn't turn up, didn't get off the plane. And at the end, with the crew coming off at the end, she dug into the bag on her shoulder and pulled out her mobile phone and walked away making a phone call. So I got on the plane and thought, oh, there's a song there. So I literally wrote many of the words going back home in the plane. I had the melody for the chorus running through my head while I was writing those lines. And I must have written, I think, probably 50 odd different portraits of people coming off the plane before culling them down to the ones I wanted to use. And the other thing I realized, of course, was that I'd made a bit of a rod for my back, because the chorus never repeats. They're different lines right throughout the chorus. And it took me a while to get to the point where I could remember the song without making a mistake. It took quite an effort to ensure that I had got it right. And the other thing about that song, of course, too, is that I would have made a mistake if I simply did no more than recording what I'd observed. So whilst it makes the observations at the beginning of the song, but getting into the second verse, I tried to find ways to create something a little bit more emotionally complex about the song, rather than just saying, oh, she's a beautiful woman and she's waiting for somebody and somebody didn't come. That wasn't what the song in the end was to be about, because there are hints in the song that, oh, maybe the relationship she shares is not quite so productive as it might be, which was me extrapolating out of the vision I had of her walking away somewhat distressed and thinking, maybe she's been stood up. I don't know, maybe this is a clandestine relationship. So there was that sense of having to try and convey some of that in the song, rather than just saying, oh, it's about someone who didn't turn up. And it's one of those songs, as I said, I get asked to sing very frequently, and I rarely do a concert without it.
Yeah, well, I like those kind of songs that it's a story, like a little short story. And,
oh yeah,
and more than just, like you said, an observation, And I think that's what intrigues people when they listen to a lot of your music, A couple other tracks off of Dancing in the Rain that I have an affinity for is Light Years from Home and Hoping I Can Fly.
Yeah, Hoping I Can Fly was very much about the breakdown of my marriage. It's me walking away from what had been a very, very difficult marriage, basically hoping I can fly. And interestingly enough, when I first started to put that album together after we'd recorded it, and I worked for the first time with a producer called Matt Fell for that album, and it turned out to be a wonderfully productive and really enjoyable process working with him. I wondered where we should put that song in the album, and interestingly enough, I was sort of saying, oh, maybe it's just a bit too close to the bone, this one. I don't know about this song. And a very dear friend of mine, who is probably my closest mate these days, had gone through what I'd gone through with the breakdown of his first marriage. And he said to me, he said, that song's going to work, because he said, it's everybody's song. He said, look at the history of divorce, and it's like almost now 1 in 3 marriages don't survive. And he said, that's everybody's song. And it was me really, really writing quite close to the bone in some ways, because I just literally sat down and wrote what I was going through, which, as one of my daughters has said to me frequently, Dad, anybody who knows you well enough knows that you write about your life. and and I've often said in that in responding to that sort of question or statement that the one thing I've tried to do as a writer is take my own personal experiences, but in some way or other, try and find a way to demonstrate what I've learned or what I've gone through, the context of some of those problems, and perhaps draw some conclusions about them that are valuable initially to myself. And, you know, I've often heard a lot of writers say that the process can be quite cathartic.
There you go.
Because you use it as therapy.
Therapeutic, yes.
Yeah, very therapeutic. That's indeed what Light Years from Home is about. You can interpret Light Years from Home in several ways. The most immediate interpretation for me, and the one that drove the song initially, is writing about someone who has some serious emotional issues, about feeling isolated, about feeling that life is a bit of a black hole. And, you know, you could, if you wished, you could interpret it as someone up there in a spaceship, but that ain't what it's about. That's the initial, that's the surface image. If you dig below the surface, it's a lot more complex than that. A lot more complex.
Right, like Bowie's Major Tom. You know. It's
oh yeah.
Not
oh
about,
yeah.
Not really. You know. But
no,
yeah.
not at all. Not at all.
Well, moving on to 2017's No Intermission. I like the concept of that. You know, there isn't an intermission. You know, there's no breaks. You know, it's just, you know, it's life. You know.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, indeed.
The title track, and then as well as A Long Time Coming. That's another one that I really enjoy.
The title track, No Intermission, grew out of an observation I'd made. Freddie and I moved our business at one stage to an old industrial building that had been converted very beautifully into office space down by the harbour at a suburb in Sydney called Balmain. And not long after we first moved there, I was looking out the window of my office, which looked out over a park, which went from the road past our office down to the harbour. And I noticed an elderly couple come down regularly, almost every day, and sit on the old wooden seat at the bottom of the park down by the water and feed the birds. They'd sit there for half an hour, maybe 3/4 of an hour, and then wander back up the path in the park to wherever home happened to be. And then about 8 months later, after I'd first observed them, she came down on her own, and I never saw him again. And that observation was made back in the mid-90s. And I wondered frequently about how I could use that image in a song. But of course, the song then expands on that image very significantly. I've never met the couple. I didn't know them. I didn't know their history. I didn't know what was going on in their lives at all. And in the end, it simply became a way into, as you said at the beginning of the question, expanding on that sense that life doesn't have an intermission, that life goes on, and that, you know, we all have to live in the moment and enjoy the moment, which is that verse about them sitting on the wooden seat and feeding the birds and she telling him that she loves him, etc. There's also a hint that he might be blind in the song. It's never said. And I wasn't sure. He may have been, but I'm not certain. So I didn't say it because he was a little frailer than she was. And so she always held his hand, and he had a walking stick. But in the end, it was just simply a way of getting into the concept of the album, which was, there is no intermission, life goes on. The other song you mentioned, Long Time Coming, that's about my beautiful Mary Ann. It's very simple. There's a song earlier on Dancing in the Rain called Martha's Beach, which is where I grew up as a kid when I was young in Melbourne, down with my grandparents at their house on the beach at Mount Martha. And we now live on the beach at Castaways Beach on the coast in Queensland. And I'm literally sitting in my study looking out to the ocean. Like a lot of us, and some of my contemporaries, and particularly one of my brothers, both of us have had difficult marriages that have come unstuck. But this relationship is just the great joy of my life, quite frankly. And it's been a long time coming. And it's written about her. It's written about where we live. It's written about essentially what she means to me. And as I've often said, or she often will say, "Oh, that's my song," and it is.
It's her song. Well, moving on to your latest, Behind Every Mask. If Sorrow Should Find You. I think that's got the greatest lyrics and message in that song. You know, the kind of every cloud has a silver lining, you know, and and to try to look at the positives. I think that's a really good lyrics in that one.
It was written for two reasons, Greg. And ironically, it took on significantly more power as a consequence of the world being hit with COVID than I had initially thought it might. I began the song towards the end of 2019, before we'd all begun to be made aware of just what this awful bloody virus could do to us. And what prompted it at that point were two things. I have a daughter, my third daughter, was born with a genetic disease called cystic fibrosis. And she's now 36. And in her late 20s, she'd fallen heavily in love with a really nice bloke, actually. And for all in the family, we were overjoyed that she seemed to have found love in circumstances where that for someone with cystic fibrosis can be very difficult. In the end, he walked away from the relationship after 12 months because he couldn't cope with the fact that she had cystic fibrosis and therefore had a limited life expectancy and probably wouldn't be able to have more than one child. I'd written about that incident in particular on one of the other songs on the Dancing in the Rain album, called Love Will Come For You, which was quite specifically written about a phone call I took from her to tell me that he was calling it quits. So in a way, If Sorrow Should Find You was prompted by that, but it was also prompted by the terribly sad suicide of a musician that I'd worked with on the previous 2 albums and had worked with occasionally in live environments. He was a brilliant, brilliant musician. But not only that, he was a real polymath. He had been a very brilliant student when he was young. He could quite easily have gone on to play professional tennis. He'd won the New South Wales Junior Tennis Championship when 2 years younger than the main competition. He had a marriage with another country singer. He was known very widely in the sort of pop rock country market as a brilliant studio musician and guitar player. He was meticulous in everything he did. All his equipment would be perfect. He'd turn up to a studio with new strings, ready to do a session, immaculate equipment, and lovely, lovely player. He took his own life in circumstances that absolutely flattened everybody that he'd worked with. There were over 600 people at his funeral service, and none of us could understand what had happened and why. And not even his wife, whom I knew really well, had any inkling that he might take his own life. So it was partly written to say to her, love will find you. It will come back. And one of the joys of my life at the moment is that for her it's happened. She's fallen in love with the guy called Josh Cunningham out of a band called The Waifs. She's deliriously happy, which is really lovely to see because she's a gorgeous woman. For my daughter, hasn't quite happened, unfortunately. She's on her own. She's very bright. She's a clinical psychologist. But she would love to have a deeply stable, long-term relationship. But I keep telling her, it'll probably happen. Look at me, you know, I had a long time. And it's the other thing about that song that's interesting is I sing the chorus in falsetto.
Yeah.
It's right at the top end of my full voice range, and I couldn't sing it full voice. So I do it in falsetto, which is something I'd never tried before, but it worked beautifully. And I said to Matt Fell when we were thinking about doing it, I said, look, I don't want to lower the key of this any further because the verses are at the bottom of my range anyway. And the chorus is a leap, another octave. And I said, I want to try it with a falsetto. So we did it that way and it worked beautifully. I'm really delighted with the way that one came up.
Oh, yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is that there's a line in it that says, if you search through your past, you'll find every mask hides questions you'll ask and repeat. Of course, that became so much more prescient after all of a sudden we're all being told to wear masks. And I wrote it in a metaphorical sense. It wasn't written in a physical sense. It was just a metaphor for the way in which so often we conceal what's going on in our lives by putting up a bit of a mask. Yeah. And someone said to me, "Oh, you're just cashing in on COVID, aren't you?" I said, it's written before that.
You're ahead of your time there. Wow. Well, a couple of 3 other tracks I wanted to mention off of this that take me back. Now that's the kind of song when I hear that title, I know I'm going to like that song. Just take me, going back to memories and better times. I just knew, and then sure enough, listening to it, I really enjoyed that one. And then Runaway Road.
Yep.
You'll Be Okay. And 1 and 1 is 2. Those are my picks from that album.
Take Me Back was me reflecting on the time I spent living in the Blue Mountains to the west of Sydney. And that's where I wrote most of the Dancing in the Rain album. And I've always loved that part of the mountains up at a place called Mount Victoria. It was a very simple song about the joy of living there, but also more importantly, of course, about the need to preserve the environment and to take note of the fact that bushfires in that part of New South Wales have become significantly more intense and more damaging. And we really have to do something about getting to terms with what we are now being confronted with around the world. And I look at what's happening in Canada at the moment and the impact it's having on America. And it's sadly a very powerful reminder of what undoubtedly will be more and more intense climatic events as we struggle to deal with the situation we find ourselves in. Runaway Road was literally written about the suicide of my guitar player, trying to find a way to understand what it was, and perhaps also coming to the conclusion that suicide in the end is no way to deal with what seems like an insurmountable problem. It's about talking, it's about communicating, it's about letting yourself be vulnerable enough to seek help, and to recognize that you do need help. And you know, very sadly, so many people who take their own lives, and I'm pretty certain that was the case with Glenn Hanna, sometimes think that everybody around them, their family and their kids and their wife and their friends, will be better off without them being around. And that's a terrible, terrible conclusion to reach in your life, and think the only solution is to depart. That just seems pointless to me. He'll Be Okay was written largely out of what my brother went through. My brother is a now retired former very eminent judge in Australia. He was Chief Justice in common law in New South Wales, and he was asked by the government at the time if he would lead the Royal Commission into Child Abuse, which he led for 5 years. And it was an emotionally very, very intense experience for 5 years of his life. And he decided at the end of that he would retire. And he's been asked around the world to go and help other countries deal with institutional child abuse matters, but has basically declined every offer. And you know, people have been prepared to throw a lot of money at him, but he said, I've had 5 years of it. It was a very, very intense, very difficult time, and I don't need to be involved anymore. And it was intense because he and the other 5 commissioners that he led sat through interviews with people who had been invited to come and tell their story about what they'd been through. And as the Chief Justice of the Common Law Court in New South Wales, he sat in judgment on some of the worst crimes in New South Wales: murders, drug issues, extraordinarily difficult stuff. And some of those decisions were extremely difficult to make. But he often remarked that despite all that he sat through as a judge in the Common Law Court, he had never been effectively prepared for what he had to sit through as the leader of the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. He said that it was terribly confronting, very difficult to deal with emotionally. And it got to the point towards the end of that 5 years where he could no longer even sit and watch the news at night, because death and destruction and turmoil was not something he could deal with, having sat through it all day at the Royal Commission. But the one thing he said that was perhaps the best outcome of all in terms of what the Commission achieved was simply the opportunity to allow people who'd been abused to come and talk about it. And for most, it was something they had not been able to do for decades. Those that had been abused as children or as teenagers were often told and threatened by their abuser that the institution would damn them forever if they ever talked about it. And for most of them, they couldn't talk about it for 30 years or more. And for those that did, that capacity to be able to do that, but most importantly, to be believed, was what gave them some sense of closure, some sense of peace of mind. And he made it very clear right from the very beginning that that was what they were there to do. They were there to listen. They were there to believe, take it on board, and then find a way to make certain that the abuse that they went through was never repeated again. It will be, unfortunately, and there are institutions today whose behaviour is appalling, quite frankly. But it did, in so many ways, cause quite a cathartic reassessment of just what so many of those institutions, and in particular, of course, the Catholic Church, had perpetrated.
Yeah.
That song was written purely out of that experience. And there's, as you probably observed on a lot of those songs on that album in particular, I got a lot of things off my chest. There are the songs that, whilst deeply personal, they're also at the same time explore a number of issues that, for me, had been bubbling up for some time, and I'd not find a way to express them.
Your letter to America.
Yeah,
I'm reminded of, and you mentioned him earlier, I'm reminded of your fellow countrymate, Doug Ashdown's Winter in America.
yeah.
It's a great, I love that song.
Oh, it's a wonderful song.
Yeah, it's cold. I mean, the kind of song, I mean, when you listen to it, you can feel, how cold it is, and it just comes across. But in a way, I see kind of a parallel, letter to America, and what he's singing about in that is, again, it's not the brightest, most positive aspect of.
Oh no, it's not at all. And it starts with a lovely opening line. The harbor's misty in the mornings, love, or how I miss December.
Yeah.
And of course, December for us is the middle of summer.
Right, right, exactly.
And it's cold in Nashville, cold in America. That song of mine has a really interesting history, because I sat down and wrote the lyrics virtually in one sitting and didn't really change much at all. But when I got to the end of the song, I realized, of course, that I'd borrowed 2 lines from one of Bob Dylan's great songs, a song of his I've always loved. And the lines, of course, are, it's not dark yet, but it's getting there. Yeah. And it seemed such a perfect way to end what was, in more than anything else, me just diarising my distress about what America was going through, what it had meant to me, and my sense that so much of the best things in America were being buried by what America was going through, particularly in the Trump era. And I thought, oh, if I'm going to quote Bob Dylan, I probably ought to get his permission to use those two lines. So I sent a note off to his publishing representatives in Australia. They sent me back a 4-page document to fill in. It said, fill this in, send it back to us. It'll probably take 8 weeks before we get a response, and it's highly unlikely that you'll get permission anyway. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I should just change the lyric a little bit. And then I remembered that my great friend Danny O'Keefe is a very rare songwriter in that he has a co-write with Bob Dylan. There's a song called Well, 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 which Danny recorded, and several other people have done it. I think the Blind Boys from Alabama have done it as well. That Danny co-wrote with Bob. So I sent a note to Danny and said, mate, here's a set of lyrics. I've got no melody at this stage, but I've quoted Bob Dylan at the end of it. Do you know anybody in Bob's management company or Bob himself where I could perhaps run this past them and see if I can get permission to use it? He wrote me back and said, mate, I don't think there's a hope in hell that they'll give you permission. They guard his catalogue really carefully. But here's Jeff Rosen's email address, and Jeff is Bob's manager. He said, give it a shot. So around about 8 o'clock one morning, I sat down and wrote an email to Jeff Rosen, attached the lyrics, said, I don't have a melody yet, but I was wondering whether or not you might be happy for me to use Bob's 2 lines at the end of my song. In less than an hour, I got an email back from Jeff Rosen saying, go for it, which just blew me away. You know, after everybody had said you'll never get it, to then get such a quick response and such a positive response was remarkable. So then I sat down and worked my way through trying to get a melody for it and making it work as a song. And it's quite long. It's well over 6 minutes long. And then I sent it off to Jeff after I'd recorded it, and just got a brief note that just said, love it. And it's a very different piece for me in so many ways, in that as you note, I speak the first verse, and speak part of the last verse of it as well. And it was one of those pieces of music where I left it with my producer to work out how he wanted to treat it. I just simply put down a guitar part and the vocal and sent it down to him and said, go for it, do what you want with it. Give it the drama, give it the energy, give it the vitality it needs, but at the same time, give it some of the darkness it needs as well. He sent me back his initial approach. It then went to the drummer, who overdubbed all sorts of percussion things on it. And I made a couple of changes to the percussion track and darkened it up in a couple of spots. But apart from that, it's not got a lot on it, and it didn't need a lot. I wondered, when thinking about how I might do it in concert, whether or not it might work with just the guitar part and my voice, and started to perform it with some apprehension, in fact, initially. But it's been really interesting. Among the songs I've been doing on stage over the course of the last 2 years or so, it's probably the one that's got the most visceral reaction from audiences. It's one of those songs where at the end you get that almost suspension of time before the audience breaks into applause. It's like They're
Right.
so absorbed in the emotion of what it's about. They don't want to break that feeling. And that happens very, very rarely, but it's happened a few times with that song. So it gets really interesting action. And I think it gets such interesting action too, of course, because, you know, America's been such a huge part of our cultural lives and has influenced so much of the world that everybody I know in Australia is really lamenting what this America we've all looked up to for so long has been going through, and desperately hoping it finds a way through its enormous sense of conflict. And of course, the enormous violence that's been wrought upon Americans by their gun laws. You know, we clamped down on our gun laws in Australia some years ago, and it made a huge difference. And it's sad that America can't seem able to come to some understanding of what they need to do to stop gun violence.
Because you've got the hugely powerful lobbyists, you know, the NRA, you know, and you've got that's what you talked about earlier, that gulf, you know, the partisanship. It's just sickening to see, you know, when young people, you know, school children, you know, murdered, you know, weekly, and then they just want to, you know, argue about it, you know. I don't know where it's headed. I don't know. Yeah.
Who knows at this stage? Who knows, sadly.
Yeah. Well, I think we've come to a good, this has been very enjoyable, Mike. I had a feeling it would be, but it has been very rewarding talking to you and hearing a lot of your stories and, you know, recounting a lot of things that, you know, in your life and the personal stories. I think that's what people really like to hear and you know, when they watch a video or, I mean, when they watch an interview, you know, they like that too. It helps them get connected, I think.
Yeah. Greg, I have to tell you, this is one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done. And the delight
Really?
is, oh yeah, the delight is that, you know, the questions reflect your interest in my music, but also suggest you've done your homework, you know what you wanted to ask, and you have a sense of the progression of what this interview should be. So, mate, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Really has.